Let me welcome you. We are trying to make things work here without Lauren Palmer, so you understand my dilemma. Panelists, if y'all would come on back up here. Let me introduce everyone. We are in search of a TV, I think, to be able to plug into, because we can't figure out how to get it on the wall. But I have a very visual heavy presentation tonight, so you get to look at this little screen, and I will walk it around for you a little bit. All right, first of all, welcome, and some of you came last week and others did not, so we are talking about The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. It is a book written by an avowed atheist, and so I hope you will see by the end what we have supplemented to make sure that his excellent research and points that he makes also have a biblical perspective. And so we actually are much more fortunate than our author because we kind of have the answers to the questions he poses. So hang in with us. Last week we had Logan Hughes with us from Abilene, but he's not available because of rehearsals. So our panel tonight, we have Mark Siptak. What do you do for a living? I was going to ask you that before. You're retired, and retired what did you do? Okay, CPA, UT Southwestern, and retired. Mark has 2 daughters, 2 sons that they have raised, and 5 grandchildren. Our second one is Heidi Carrollton. She is now with the Department of Homeland Security, but previously was a CPS worker. So she's going to speak to us a little bit later about a few things, but we're happy to have Heidi. She has 2 sons, ages 10 and 13, right? And Susanna Copeland has authored a book called Love and the Art of Saying No. She is a trained life coach, but she is currently mostly staying home with 3- and 4-year-old Suki and Zelda. So thank you guys for coming. And we are going to just skip right to our first question, and then if we get the visuals for the others, I think they would really help. What we're trying to do, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the book review, the idea of a book review. My mother used to do these, where you would go to a book club and you would present enough about a book to make everybody want to go buy and read the book. And that's all we can do in 4 weeks, an hour at a time here this week, or this month. And so we're going to be giving just snippets, but it really is helpful if you read the book. So if you feel a little lost, just read the book. So our first question for our panel is, which data points in the first chapter, which we did talk about last week, were the most interesting to you and why? So Mark?
I think that's a little deceiving because, I mean, really it went from 13% to 29%. So, that's kind of like a 16% increase in, the population. So, and then for the boys, it was for a lesser degree. So for that whole time period, the boys went from having a major depression episode during their teen years, went from 5% to 11%. So, the boys went up 6% and the girls went up 16%. So major difference between the sexes during that time period for a depression episode. I thought that was interesting.
Okay. Heidi?
That was also the most interesting factor for me, was the prevalence between boys and girls. And the fact is that the prevalence of the mental health disorders rose by 145% for girls between 2004 and 2020, and 161% for boys. And that was actually surprising to me because I would have guessed that it would have been a much larger increase for the girls than the boys, but it was boys.
I think technically it wasn't chapter 1, but like the introduction, he makes a really interesting comparison to if you were to suddenly decide to just send your baby to Mars, like all of the differences that it would make to their body, their brain, their development, and how impossible basically it would be to bring them back home and have them be well. And I just thought that analogy was so good. I felt like it needed to be brought up. But the other thing that impressed me was when he was doing all these statistics, he mentioned, because obviously self-report can really mess with mental health statistics a lot, but they actually did a lot of the numbers based on more quantifiable things like suicide attempts reported by like hospitals, and people being medicated by psychiatric facilities, things like that, that were a little bit more solid and not just like they say they have depression or they say they feel depressed. You know, like that's probably also way more common, but I was just, because it is, a lot of times you can have some pretty good looking statistics to sort of make your point, but like he's very good at backing himself up with good research, so.
Thank you. A slide that I have, y'all can come look at these later when you come up.
Lindsay, would you like me to make copies for you? If you have the originals, I can make copies.
I just have them in PowerPoint, so we'll just carry on. I'm just throwing it up there. Occasionally there's a dramatic looking graph, and so I want you to see how dramatic it is, okay?
Y'all can give her your email if you want her to email it to you later.
Yeah, I can email it too. Next week I'll have copies ready in case we have this problem. All right, so the characteristics of this present mental illness epidemic, they're really calling it an epidemic. Primarily they are internalizing disorders like anxiety, fear, and sadness. And they've already touched on how much they rose for the boys and the girls. These kinds of disorders tend to be self-compounding. People tend to become more depressed when they feel socially disconnected, and so a play-based childhood strengthens. So we'll be talking about that. Internalizing disorders also have physical consequences, self-harm being one of them. Gender-differentiated emphases, girls' social lives move to social media, and boys into a virtual world. So what boys and girls have done with this technology tends to be very different, and yet there's an impact on both boys and girls. And then results impacted all age groups and caused a lack of full presence. They have a hard time just being present in a room. So our author justifies all his claims about key ingredients for human flourishing in 3 ways. He cites data regarding typical mammalian development. He explains theories pertaining to the evolutionary process, and he uses statistics to show correlation between trends of social norms and trends of mental health patterns. So we're not going to agree with all his methods of research or his conclusions that he reaches having to do with evolutionary development and things like that, but we will be bringing scripture in to comment on the results that he found. So without dismissing all the research that he's done here, we need to claim this as our first major perspective checkpoint. As Christians, we know that God designed human brains and bodies on purpose, in detail, and that God's blueprint for flourishing represents the apex of reliability, because the maker is the expert on that which is made. The way dogs or chimpanzees function and theories about prehistoric adaptations of physiognomy may be interesting side notes, but God remains the authoritative source. I did not get that from the book. That's us talking here, okay? All right, so our next slides that you're not going to see, I'm just going to have to read them to you. Haidt claims that there are 5 important features of human childhood. So as we consider each of his 5 important characteristics of human childhood, consider the impact that social media makes. Okay, let me prop this way. Slow growth, giving time to learn instead of everything having to be accelerated. Proverbs 22:6, and I wish I could have y'all help me read these. You're going to have to listen to me a lot tonight. Can you see them? Yeah. You have them so tiny. All right, read those scriptures for me.
Okay. Train children in the right way, and when old, they will not stray. Proverbs 22:6. And then, keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your homes and on your gates. Deuteronomy 6:6-9.
Thank you. The second characteristic is free play. Physical play outdoors with uncostly mistake-making available allows repetition, which trains the brain. So 1 Corinthians 13:11. Heidi, can you read that?
I can actually see this one.
All right.
When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. 1 Corinthians 13:11. And then, and the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in its streets. Zechariah 8:5.
All right, the next characteristic is attunement. It's what you get when you're face-to-face with the baby. You know, they learn so much just from expressions and from communication. Human connection made possible by practice serve and return interactions that begin in infancy and cultivate empathy and the ability to be fully present joyfully. So 1 John 3:18.
Little children, let us love not in word or speech, but in deed and truth.
They are reading some really tiny print. I'm really impressed. Thank you. Okay, the fourth one is social learning, learning to be part of the group via conformist bias and prestige bias. So Susanna, can you read from Philippians?
Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. As for the things that you have learned and received and heard and noticed in me, do them, and the God of peace will be with you. Philippians 4:8-9.
All right, and then our fifth one is expectant brains and sensitive periods. Certain periods of cognitive development have exceptional vulnerability to overt shaping by any source, whether positive or negative. So from Matthew 18:2-6. Heidi?
Jesus called a child whom he put among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If any of you cause one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for you if a great millstone were," it's blurry now.
"Fastened around your neck, and you were drowned in the depth of the sea."
Sorry.
Matthew 18:2-6. All right, so next we're going to do table discussion, and thankfully I made copies for your tables instead of depending on the slides. So if you will discuss the second set of questions, it starts with, would you agree with the following statements? And then question 2. We'll be talking about those around your tables. right. Are we about done discussing? Do we have time? All right, we're going to move on to chapter 3 of your book. It's titled Discover Mode and the Need for Risky Play. Thank you. Mark's gone to look for a TV. We're still determined to get this up here, but we'll see. Hopefully he'll be back in time for the question. All right, in chapter 3, Haidt claims that children need to experience risk-taking and even hardship in order to develop resilience. He makes a case for inadvertently created fragility as a root cause of mass anxiety. So in chapter 3, our author differentiates between two different mindsets, which he calls discover mode and defend mode. Discover mode is a behavioral activation system which detects opportunities and brings about positive emotions and shared excitement. Defend mode is referred to as a behavioral inhibition system where threats are detected, you stop what you are doing, and stress hormones are activated. So in discover mode, you think of someone just looking around scanning for opportunities. It's like a kid in a candy shop, right? A child would learn to think for himself, and his statement would be, let me grow. And in defend mode, we're constantly scanning for dangers. We have a scarcity mindset as opposed, here comes a TV. Thank you, guys. We'll get these words up in front of you in just a minute. But we have a scarcity mindset. You cling to your team, and your watchword is keep me safe. So if you think about these two modes as being one or the other is going to become your child's default. Now, if we're all in discover mode and there is true danger, then of course we're going to go into defend mode. But if your default is defend mode and you're all the time looking for danger, that is problematic for kids. So when Haidt claims that children need to experience risk-taking and even hardship in order to develop resilience. He makes a case for inadvertently created fragility as a root cause of mass anxiety, using everything from playground structure to cable news to accepted norms about unsupervised children and legal consequences for bucking those changing norms. Haidt argues that overprotection and over-supervision are literally crippling children. He uses the example of trees which lack wind stress, which topple over and die because their root systems aren't deep. He mentions, I forget if it was in the introduction or in this chapter, he talks about Biosphere 2, which is an experiment that was conducted in the 80s and 90s, I think, in Arizona. This was built to be a habitat for 8 people to live in for, I think, 2 years was the plan. And it was supposed to replicate the Earth in that they were going to produce all the food, all the oxygen, all the things that they needed to live for 2 years. My oldest daughter actually went there on a school field trip, and they saw it when the 8 people were still living in there. And what they discovered, this is a completely enclosed biosphere, and the trees grew fast because every circumstance was perfect. They had the perfect light, the perfect nutrition, everything. But after a point, the trees started caving in on themselves and just falling over. And the reason was, what do you think it lacked? Wind. Wind creates what they actually call stress wood that's created because of having to bend back and forth. And so these trees that had this perfect environment couldn't even survive, couldn't stand up. They just fell over. Some of the trunks just literally collapsed in on themselves because it was missing this vital piece. So just thinking about this kind of fragility. And our next question for the panel is, we're asking them to get a little personal here, but consider this scripture. Jesus said, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. And this is from John 15, 1 and 5 through 6. So my next question for the panel, and we're going to get Mark up here in a minute, but we'll start with Susanna this time. Have you been pruned to be made more fruitful? And how did it feel, and what was the result?
Yes. I think the best example that's not too, like, that's vague enough to be quick, is having certain relationships in my life, especially friendships, pruned away, and it was awkward and painful and ugly at times and entirely necessary. So, because you don't really learn boundaries till you set some boundaries. So,
Thank you. Heidi?
Yes. Also, without going into too much detail, I had a pretty chaotic childhood. My family, they're not Christians, and for generations, we're from central Iowa. Nobody moved away. They're all very enmeshed. And my husband took a job that required us to move to Texas. And so I was the first person ever in my family to ever move away. And we came here and we found this church, and that's how I became a Christian.
The good soil.
Very good soil.
Thank you. Mark?
So pruning happens in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's by the Spirit's chastening, I think, about something that we've done. Bosses in our evaluations, by them, they kind of point out things that need to be changing. Once you're married, your spouse kind of helps with that process. And then when you have kids, you find you have even more rough edges, right? God uses these in all different forms, and there's so many ways that we're chastened. And I was trying to tell Debbie on the way over here. I said, well, what can I say? I said, well, here's a stupid one. When I first got out of college and gotten my first job, I was working as a junior accountant, and my dad used to whistle when he worked around cars and stuff, and that became a habit with me. It was just a way of relaxing while I worked, and I was whistling around the office, and there came a memo out to everybody. No whistling is allowed in this office. And I'm like, okay, been singled out here. And so I went and talked to it was the president of the company. It was a small company, but I said, well, so what's the deal with whistling? And he said, well, that's commonly something that can be an irritant to people, and it's best not done in an office setting. So I said, okay, I can understand that. So, it's all those things help you develop. I was young. I didn't know all this stuff, It makes sense now that I'm older, but it's all those chipping aways at things you think are okay and suddenly find out aren't okay.
All right. Next question. As a mom or dad or grandpa, is it hard for you to get excited about the pruning your children or grandchildren have or will receive? How hard is it to watch this with your children?
Oh, I get to go first. Okay. So it's not exciting to see your kids get pruned or your grandkids. But it's important. And that this is how they grow. They need to have some of the rough edges smooth off. And nobody likes it, and we don't always like, to see them go through it. But it is a part of growing up, I think.
Heidi?
I also agree that I'm not excited about my children being pruned, only because it's painful, right? And as a mom, you don't want to see your kids hurt or struggle. You just want to fix everything for them. So it's hard. Yeah.
I actually don't have as much trouble. Because I have known people who have never suffered anything. They do exist, or at least anything is substantial. I'll say that. And there's a big difference between sympathy and empathy, and as believers, the capacity to relate to someone else's suffering is incredibly valuable in how we love them. There's only so far we can go in sympathy, in my opinion and in my experience. And also, like it almost puts a ceiling on how close to God that people can get when they haven't been through the pruning process much, just by observation. And if you want like a thought experiment, you can go on YouTube and type in the word entitled and maybe arrested. And that is a good example of what sort of like basic, like just common sense life pruning can prevent. Because you see people who have just literally never been told no, being told no by authorities and being like physically incapable of accepting that. And it's fascinating. Like the algorithm totally has me figured out, because I love watching those, because it's fascinating to see someone go through a crisis where they've literally never been told no before. And now they're like, I need to call my dad. And they're like, you are 23. No. You're going to jail. You can call them from jail. But like, I think that it's sort of an easy, tangible, like real world example of sort of like, there's sort of natural pruning that everyone goes through. And then when you apply that to us as believers, the suffering that we undergo as believers on behalf of Christ, or like in our walks with Jesus, help us to be able to have wisdom to speak into other people's lives. And yeah.
Thank you. I think we're up on the next one here. Chapter 4. We're moving on to chapter 4 now, and it is entitled Puberty and the Block Transition. And he talks about things that have hindered development. Is that working? Did we lose it? Should be the one with the Christmas tree. Okay, Christmas tree. So, experience blockers would be safetyism. I did not know this term until I read this book, but suddenly it just made so much sense. And he even refers at times to the cult of safetyism. So think about that for a minute. And another experience blocker is a smartphone. You can be lost in that world of constant action and activity and instant feedback and miss out on everything that's going on around you. And some things that experiences that encourage a healthy transition to childhood are milestone expectations and rites of passage. So our next section is going to be some good table discussion around is there a book at every table? At least one book at every table? I have mine if we need one. If you will go to pages 106 and 107, they're proposing some milestones on even years of a child's life starting at age 6. And I'd really like for you to discuss those and just decide what you think, having to do with recognizing even year birthdays with new freedoms, new responsibilities, and increases in allowance. And do you think your circle of peers or your children's circle of peers would buy into agreement on these milestones? I'll tell you, my neighborhood, I have a chat group with about 80 women on it in my neighborhood who do everything from borrow groceries to just all the things. It's really kind of funny to watch. And they have a meeting set for the end of this month at a restaurant to discuss this book. And this is neighbors who don't know each other, you know, where they stand spiritually or morally, but I think they're wanting to have some agreement about what are the rules going to be about our kids so they can have freedom in the neighborhood. And I really kind of love that they're doing that. So a lot of what this book is about, and we'll see this when we get to the end with his proposals of what you can do about these problems, is that getting buy-in from your peers is going to be huge if we can be in agreement so that no kid is the only one left without a phone at age 14 or whatever. So take some time to discuss those questions. It's at the end of your list of questions, and hopefully every table has a book. Thank you. going to bring the mic to anybody who might be able to think of an example of safetyism that you've seen. Can you think of something where we have overdone the safety to a child's detriment? Raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic. Sorry. Okay, just talking about safetyism. Keeping a child so safe that you may be keeping them from developing. Okay, anybody have an example that they'd like to share? Just let me know. I'll bring you the mic. Okay, I'm going to go to Lewis first because I'm going to give you the whole mic in a minute. Okay.
Well, one that I know we were talking about just the other day with a group of my friends was the playground. When I was a kid, we had metal slides, and we had the seesaws, the spinner, all these things, and we're all here today, and everything that we had on our playground that I can think of, including swings, have been taken off of today's playgrounds. Kids are going to get hurt, and it's part of life, and sometimes you let them get hurt in a supervised environment where they can be taken care of rather than on their own or discover it at a later age that things happen in life. And I think the playground is a perfect example. We don't want them to get a scratch, and that's not life.
Thank you. I think he hit on a good point, though. He said in a supervised environment. We're not talking about free-for-all. Let them just, have anything, but letting them figure out that metal slide is going to burn your, what? We figured it out, we Texans. Something you haven't experienced in Minnesota, but all right. Anyone else?
Something similar, but along the same lines as him is I've seen parents of Gen Z and millennials and Gen Alpha, but they don't let their children go anywhere without them taking them there and them picking them up. And there's no trust in any other adults, and any other adults cannot, say, excuse me, son, you do not do this, right? Because I'm sorry, that's stealing and you're not allowed to. They go totally bat crap crazy and yell at the person for correcting their child. But yeah, I mean, just so isolationist. The parents are even isolated, and they have to do everything because they can't trust another person to have common sense and decency and help their child grow up.
Yeah, I have a couple examples, but I'll try to narrow it down. But one of them is, raise your hand if you know what the mom parking spot is. Anybody? Uh-huh. Or anywhere. No, not like the mother, not the expectant mother one. It's the one next to the cart return, so you don't have to walk more than 3 feet from your car with your kids in your car. Because, what if someone can get to your car before you can get back to it? That is a genuine anxiety that I got, as soon as I had my first child, was and I remember Jim noticing it the first time, and he'd never heard of it. And because he was like, oh, I just park closest as I can. I'm like, no, you gotta strategically, you gotta park right next to the, I would always get annoyed when people who didn't have kids would be in those spots, because I was like, yeah, I'm the person who does, because you don't want to walk away from them. But that's an example, I think, of safetyism where we are so paranoid. And then I would also say, frankly, I can't stop at the donut shop I've gone to my entire life and leave my kids in the car and walk 10 feet into the shop for 3 minutes and buy donuts without taking them both out of their car seats. Because I'm worried that someone's going to call CPS on me. It's not even that I think that the car is going to get stolen in Coppell, Texas. Very, very unlikely. But people are crazy. I've been chewed out for leaving my dog in a car on a 60-degree day, and it was on to go in and get a coffee. I was risking my whole car just to make sure nobody got mad at me, and I still got chewed out for leaving my dog in the car. So, you know what I mean? I think that's kind of safetyism.
Safetyism going all the extremes to a dog. Yeah. Oh yeah, this table's got lots of examples.
If you and I know some of you in here have, and I will not go into it. This is a very short story, but if you've ever had your child in organized sports and seen what some of the parents, how they act, it can get really out of hand with people wanting to be sure their child is treated properly by the coach and that nothing happens that's, offensive to their child or whatever. So you're talking about trying to learn in this book it talks about the roaming and the child's trying to learn by being in an environment where there's a group, instead of one-on-one, but a group of other children. The sports is a place where you can do it. However, with the parents, it gets a little bit crazy sometimes, I can tell you.
I'll just give an example I noticed during COVID that my youngest grandchild was in preschool, and of course the whole society is kind of guilty of safetyism, taking these little children out of their play schools, telling parents, not to congregate at the park. The doctor across the street was told that he could not afford to allow his children to play with anybody because they couldn't afford for the doctors to get sick. And of course, at some point, I guess at the very beginning, they didn't know. And, there was a learning curve there that needed to happen. But that whole reaction to what was going on, the long term of it has been very detrimental. That little boy now, my grandson, is 10, and he is very clingy to his mother to this day. And she was the one that was there for him during several years of his developmental stage. So anyway, it's not just people, we see it in a bigger arena as well.
All right, that's a good point. That year of COVID and trying to come out of that and figure out just how cautious we needed to be kind of took some of these things that are going on and exaggerated them. And it's been hard to come back, right, to just a reasonable place. Another thing I want to be sure and mention is rites of passage. Our culture, I'm not sure why, and the author kind of speculates a little bit on this, but with the mixing of cultures that we have in our communities, and just with a lot of different factors, just real rites of passage are not observed anymore, where you might, we're not going to all go do ancient Native American rites of passage or anything like that, but we've kind of gotten away from really noting an age. And I like this idea of every other year having kind of a step up, and if it could involve a retreat or a dinner or something where you kind of take the child out for a little bit and then re-enter as sort of a different stage of life, is something we ought to consider how to kind of reinstate that.
Well, unfortunately, people think that it's a right versus a privilege for your child to, when your child turns a certain age, it's a privilege to be able to do whatever. It's not a gimme, and that's a real problem that I see out there.
Well, yes, and earning that next stage would definitely be a part of it.
R-I-T-E, right? R-I-G-H-T.
Right.
Yeah,
But
don't know the difference of the words anymore, so.
Well, but just to say you have turned 14 now, so we're going to do this when a child has not earned it, that's to be considered too. Yeah. All right, Heidi, will you come up and just give us, since Heidi has worked for Child Protective Services, it did come up the things you don't want to do because you're so afraid of somebody calling, and there are some pretty wild cases. But I want to let Heidi address that before we close.
So I spent probably 14 years in minimally the child welfare system. A good chunk of that was as a CPS investigator. And there is a general fear of the public that anything they might do, somebody might call CPS. And there's a belief by the callers to CPS that they're actually going to investigate or do things, regardless of the context of the call. People do call in ridiculous things. They really do. But CPS can't protect kids who actually need protected. They're not going to take your kid away because you let them go to the park. They're not going to take your kid away because you name any of the fears that you guys have that CPS might come and talk to your kid or remove them or require certain services. Unless you're actually severely injuring your child, it is not likely. It's not going to happen. There are reports out there of kids who are truly being hurt by their parents that CPS can't do anything about. So just keep that in the back of your mind when you're making decisions for your kids. There aren't enough staff to even entertain a call about a kid left in a car for a minute while their parent ran in to get a donut. So that's what I want to say about safetyism in general from the CPS context. They just can't. There just isn't enough manpower to even investigate things that should be investigated. So if that gives you comfort.
I want to talk for a minute, too, about highly publicized cases and how they really change our thinking. The year my first child was born was when Adam Walsh was abducted and killed. And that was a huge case. His father became an enormous activist for missing and exploited children, has done a lot of good, but some of those stories statistically are so rare, and yet they're so huge and so powerful that I really believe that my entire child-rearing years were impacted by that kind of fear. Same with some of the extreme cases where CPS was called in and came and took children because some were unsupervised. And they do make the news, and they are big stories. But it's really important to really look at, first of all, covering your children in prayer at all times, but also seeing news stories in their perspective and maybe doing some research on the statistics before you decide that is now the norm. Because, just the magnitude of our news system can make every obscure story sound like the norm. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So that's kind of all we have for tonight. I apologize for our tech problems. I had some really cool slides. Sorry you missed them. But we'll just close with this prayer tonight. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. Thanks for coming. Grab another bite to eat. Pick up your kids if you need to, but feel free to linger for a few minutes.